I'm Sarah from The Upcoming. So lovely to chat to you. Maybe we could just kick off with a brief introduction to Surge, this fascinating and really it's kind of immersive film.
Yeah, so Surge is I guess it's a film about uh, a man living this kind of a young man in London living a quite monotonous kind of drone-like contemporary existence, and this kind of monotony or kind of emptiness seems to be kind of weighing down on him quite hard, and kind of we sense a kind of like crack moment is about to come, and yeah, it does, and he goes on this kind of slightly wild, reckless, but kind of hopefully somewhat transcendent kind of journey of trying to tune into his kind of more true self, I suppose, and throw off the kind of shackles that kind of modern urban existence can kind of press us into.
Mm. And obviously, previously you've done a lot of short films. So, what made you decide to take the plunge into a feature-length film, and why this story? I mean, I was thinking, in some ways, we've all kind of been living very monotonous lives through the pandemic. So there's kind of maybe might hit a chord with a lot of people right now in that respect. But where did you get the idea for the story?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll talk about the lockdown thing later, but I actually made a short film with Ben, but a long time ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago, called Beat, and it was a little snapshot. It definitely had kind of thematic parallels with the feature. A little snapshot of someone kind of living on the periphery of society and not, and walking the streets and behaving in a way that kind of was outside the norm of how we expect people to behave, and the kind of the tension that brought with it, but also the thrill it seemed to kind of bring him. And so that was the kind of first time Ben and I properly met, and I think we both were really intrigued by those themes. I've always kind of been quite kind of acutely attuned to. I'm not from London, but I came here, and I find kind of the city, a city this large, as a kind of organism, and how it shifts and moves, quite interesting, and what it kind of does to people, and the idea of this many million people living so closely alongside each other, and that constant kind of simmering like threat of chaos around any corner kind of thing. I always found that quite fascinating, and also on a kind of like more even deeper level, I suppose. Kind of, I've always found it interesting that kind of there's this modern world that we don't know anything else, and we take it for granted because it's all we know. But I don't know, sometimes when I kind of look at it through a certain lens, I'm like, it's really quite strange, and kind of that this is the world we've created. It feels quite kind of cold and compassionless, and kind of um and brutal in some ways, when kind of humankind as a species had kind of infinite options with what kind of world it built. It's funny that we've created this one, and it feels quite arbitrary in many ways that it's this one. But yeah, so I kind of really wanted to explore those themes. Yeah, I made shorts and television and stuff, but I guess I've always had a real hunger to make my first feature. It wasn't the most straightforward to figure out in many ways, but we got there. And I also, like you mentioned very kindly, wanted to make something that felt really immersive and experiential. And I guess as a filmmaker, I've always been kind of drawn to that side of things more than conventional kind of story in some ways. But yeah.
And you mentioned you'd already worked with Ben before. What do you think sets him apart as an actor that made you want to work with him again? And it's an incredibly committed performance. Like we really sort of believe that he is this guy unraveling, but it's very intensely focused on his performance. So, why did you want to work with him, and how did you work with him to kind of elicit that the performance you wanted?
Yeah, well, I'd always thought he was incredibly talented from seeing him in quite early work. I was lucky enough to see him play Hamlet at the Old Vic when he was quite very young, really. So was I, and saw him in TV things like Nathan Barley and in Enduring Love, and thought there was an amazing kind of almost primal physicality to how he kind of was able to use his body and like kind of physiologically consume a role as well as kind of, you know, intellectually and emotionally. And I just thought he had an amazing relationship with his kind of physical self, and that lent a real kind of visceral and kind of, yeah, immersive, I suppose, qualities his performances. And so I didn't really know him hugely at the time of making the short. We kind of asked him on a bit of a wing and a prayer, and he was really generous about it and kind of was up for doing it. And funnily enough, there was a lot of kind of movement in the short, just like there is in the feature. And he said to me, "I should warn you that I can't dance, actually." And I said, "Don't." Well, A, it turns out he definitely can dance, but B, I said to him, you know, I don't, you know, this isn't the kind of movement I'm thinking about. Don't worry. I think this is a very different kind of movement, traditional choreography. And yeah, we didn't have much money to make that short back in the day, but we spent some time in a room with me, him, and my friend Laura, a choreographer, and we kind of started to just play around with how these how these urges and kind of uh, how this yearning to break free from this kind of the monotony might manifest in the body and things. And we started playing around with that, and it was a really fascinating experience. And yeah, Serge was a kind of bigger canvas to do that. But I think in terms of why, you know, I imagine any director would want to work with him, he consumes a role in a really deep kind of profound sense. He really kind of, he really does kind of become that character and live it, and kind of, like I say, there's a real physicality to that. And I wanted to work in a particular way where I wanted to kind of like create this very liberating environment for the actor, where we could kind of shoot 360, and it was definitely that the camera was being responsive to the performance and not the other way around. I didn't want to kind of meticulously block and rehearse things and make kind of tight parameters where one should move and things like this. I wanted to kind of light 360. I wanted to kind of give as much freedom as possible to him, because there seems something fitting about that. In many ways, it's Serge is about a character kind of having a rebirth and experiencing everything anew again. And there was something that felt antithetical about overly rehearsing to that kind of theme. So yeah, we kind of, it brought a kind of wildness to the shoot at times and an unpredictability. And I guess not every actor would relish that, but it was something that Ben really, you know, I think was invigorated by. So yeah, it was a great pleasure to work with him.
And there's some really striking images that we see throughout. It was interesting there that you mentioned almost like a rebirth, like particularly I was thinking that moment in the hotel where he kind of climbs inside the mattress. But it kind of seems to move as well between the very realistic, you know, watching him doing his job, and then this slightly dreamlike, surreal elements as well. So what were you thinking about in terms of how, you know, the visual element and the look and feel of the film?
Yeah, well, that's a nice way of describing it. I suppose that's kind of perfect, really, because it was trying to look at somebody eh, living in the kind of very mundane kind of everydayness of the kind of city existence, that's that kind of ends up transcending that into a more kind of spiritual space. So I did want to kind of try, you know, and I'm not saying it succeeded, but what I was aiming for was to bring a kind of poetry and lyricism to everyday life. I think that's what I've always been drawn to as a filmmaker. I find, kind of, without being naff about it, I do find kind of beauty in the kind of like the you know, the mundane, more mundane settings. um and I do think there's a kind of poetry to life that even in the most kind of rugged and kind of bog standard kind of settings. And I think if you can kind of find that, it is really exciting. So I think that's what we were trying to do, like you say, with moments like the hotel scene. You know, it we were trying to, the themes we were trying to explore are quite kind of abstract and esoteric and kind of tricky to grasp. So that was what was challenging about the development process. It was kind of, how do we harness these quite esoteric themes into kind of real picture, you know, and sound and events. And you know, luckily we worked with two really amazing writers, Rita and Rupert, and brilliant development producers and things to kind of, yeah, figure all that out and wrangle that.
I think I'm almost out of time, but just very finally, you know, what do you hope that people will take away from the film? Because, you know, at times it is a really hard watch. And there's a lot in there about loneliness and kind of the pressure cooker of the mundane existence. But there's also moments of tenderness, and there's something liberating about watching him feel liberated. So what do you hope people take away?
Yeah, well, I think admittedly it's an unusual, film about an unusual character having an unusual experience. But having said that, I hope that it has a kind of universal appeal in how he is seeking a kind of deeper experience of life. He's looking to scratch the kind of through this kind of surface existence, which we all can kind of drift into for hours or days or weeks, months at a time. And it's something I definitely kind of grapple with, and it feels like we've come so far from our kind of primal instincts and kind of experiencing life in a kind of deeper and emotional and tactile way. And obviously I'm not suggesting Joseph's technique is the way to go about experiencing that, but as a kind of analogy for striving at something deeper and less surface, I think I hope it's kind of inspiring, even though, as you say, it's quite kind of high stress at times.
Mm. And you hope that people will be able to see it in a cinema this summer rather than, so many digital releases over the last year, but hopefully we'll
Yeah,
get back to normal.
exactly. I mean, it's got a digital release, but I feel really lucky that it's got a cinema release too. It's quite a ride at the cinema. Um, it's quite something to see on the big screen, and we did want to make it to be a cinematic experience. So it'd be amazing if some people do get to see it at the cinema. Yeah.
And quickly, do you know what you're going to do next after this?
Um, I'm talking about a few things. I'm attached to a couple of feature films, so I'm trying to figure something else of my own out, which is kind of semi improvisational. So I'm trying to lean further into that kind of freeing kind of way of working. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, can't wait to see what you do next. And thanks so much for sharing all that with us and for this brilliant film.
Thanks for talking to me. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, lovely to chat to you. See you. Thank you.